This was not negligence. It was doctrinal certainty. War planning depends on categorization, on deciding what threats matter and which do not. Japanese planners had seen submarines sink freighters and tankers. They had not seen them challenge the division between sea and land. That division felt permanent, reinforced by history and habit. Over time, confidence hardened into routine. Coastal watchkeepers learned what to ignore. The absence of precedent became proof of impossibility. A quiet shoreline meant safety. A passing train meant continuity. The sea, though dangerous, obeyed its own rules. Blind spots form not from ignorance, but from consistency. When nothing violates an assumption, the assumption becomes invisible. By 1945, Japan's coastal defenses were in the summer of 1945. Just before dawn, a United States submarine broke the surface far closer to the Japanese coast than doctrine ever intended. The sea was calm, the horizon still dark, and the hull rose quietly into air that belonged to the enemy. This was not deep water maneuvering. This was proximity measured not in miles, but in sight lines. From the bridge, the shoreline was no abstraction. Trees stood in silhouette. The faint geometry of rail lines cut across the coastal plain. Buildings and embankments were visible enough to count, close enough to feel. The submarine had crossed a distance normally reserved for land forces, not naval patrols. It floated there, exposed, its greatest strength, stealth, temporarily surrendered. Below deck, the crew moved with deliberate restraint. Orders were passed in low voices. Metal contacted metal only when necessary. Every man understood what surfacing here meant. Aircraft could appear without warning. Coastal guns might already be ranging the water. Escape, if needed, would not be immediate. Yet the boat held position, suspended between concealment and consequence. There were no ships to engage. No convoys. No destroyers prowling offshore. The ocean offered nothing worth a torpedo. For a submarine built to hunt steel hulls at sea, the emptiness was unsettling. The mission parameters, carefully defined back at base, did not include this silence. Then someone noticed the tracks. They ran parallel to the beach, uninterrupted, functional. A piece of inland infrastructure revealed by chance and proximity. Trains moved there routinely, connecting towns that had never considered the sea a threat. From below the surface, submarines were an offshore concern. From land, they were irrelevant. On the bridge, no one spoke of attacking land. There were no procedures for it. The deck gun was not intended for rail traffic. The patrol orders made no mention of targets beyond the water line. And yet the presence of that track altered the meaning of the moment. The war, which had maintained clear boundaries between domains, pressed suddenly against its own edges. The submarine remained surfaced. The shore remained quiet. Nothing had happened yet, but something had already changed. The distance between sea and land had collapsed, and with it, the assumptions that kept war neatly divided. In the stillness before action, an idea began to take shape, one no manual anticipated, and one that could not be unthought once seen. As the light slowly lifted from the horizon, the lookouts focused their binoculars inland, tracing the parallel lines that had first caught their attention. At first, there was nothing, only stillness and routine geography. Then motion appeared where motion did not belong. A dark shape slid into view along the tracks, steady and deliberate. It was unmistakable. A train. It moved without escort, without camouflage, following a schedule built on the assumption that the sea could not reach this far. From the bridge, the sight registered with quiet disbelief. Submarines hunted ships. Trains belonged to another war entirely. And yet there it was, steel on rails, passing through the morning as if the ocean behind it were irrelevant. No doctrine addressed this moment. Submarine warfare manuals spoke of tonnage, convoy patterns, periscope angles, and torpedo solutions. They did not account for locomotives. The deck gun was designed for surface targets of opportunity, small vessels, damaged ships, finishing blows. It was not artillery. It was not meant to reach inland. The officers exchanged measured glances. Nothing in their training prohibited the idea outright, but nothing endorsed it either. The target felt misplaced, almost illusory, as if it belonged to another campaign layered briefly over this one. War had rules, and this seemed to sit just outside them. Below deck, word spread carefully. Men paused at their stations, listening without speaking. Some searched for confirmation that this was real. Others waited for the idea to be dismissed. Hesitation moved through the boat not as fear, but as uncertainty, an awareness that crossing this line would create a moment that could not be undone. The train continued forward, unaware. Each second reduced the distance between possibility and decision. The crew understood the risk. Surface so close to shore, the submarine was exposed. Firing would announce its presence unmistakably. There would be no second chances, no rehearsal. Still, the thought did not retreat. It settled instead. What began as an anomaly sharpened into a question of intent. If the war had reached this point, if boundaries had already dissolved, then perhaps the absence of precedent was not a warning, but an opening. The submarine held its course. The train rolled closer. And in the narrow space between what was expected and what was possible, an idea took shape, quietly, deliberately, and against every assumption that had governed the war until that moment. On the bridge, the captain stood still, eyes moving between shoreline and sea. He understood precisely where the submarine was and how exposed it had become. Surfaced this close to land, the boat was vulnerable to aircraft, artillery, even small arms fire. Every instinct shaped by years of submarine warfare urged caution. And yet caution alone could no longer answer what lay ahead. The question was not only tactical. It was legal, moral, and historical. Submarines were instruments of sea denial, not land attack. The rules of engagement had been written with shipping lanes in mind, not rail lines. One order, spoken aloud, would stretch the definition of naval warfare into unfamiliar territory. The captain knew that whatever followed would be attached to his name alone. Behind him, the crew waited without pressure or protest. No one argued. No one urged restraint. They understood the gravity of silence as well as any command. Each man sensed that this pause mattered, that what was being decided would define not just the patrol, but the meaning of what they were doing so close to shore. The coastline remained unchanged. The train continued its steady movement inland, unaware of the deliberation unfolding offshore. No alarm sounded. No defensive fire appeared. The moment carried an eerie calm, as though the war itself had briefly stepped aside to observe. In war, choice is rarely abstract. It arrives compressed by circumstance, stripped of context, and forced into narrow windows of time. This was one of those moments. Delay would mean nothing. Action would mean everything. The captain understood that refusing now would preserve doctrine, but accepting would test it. He considered the risk to the boat, to the crew, and to the mission as a whole. He considered whether restraint still served a purpose so late in the war. And finally, he considered what it meant to encounter an opportunity that history had not prepared him for. When the order came, it was spoken evenly. No emphasis. No drama. Just instruction. The crew acknowledged it with the same calm professionalism that had carried them across oceans and through patrols already forgotten by the wider war. The deck gun crew moved into position. Final checks were made. The submarine remained surfaced, exposed, committed. Nothing outward marked the significance of the moment. No record was written yet. No witness stood on shore to observe what was about to happen. But in that quiet interval, between decision and execution, history shifted slightly, unnoticed, preparing to move in a direction no one on either side had imagined possible. Japanese coastal defense doctrine in 1945 was shaped by expectation rather than imagination. The threat, as planners understood it, came from the sea in predictable forms: surface fleets, carrier aircraft, amphibious landings. Shore batteries faced outward. Observation posts scanned the horizon. The coastline was treated as a boundary, an edge where naval war ended and land war began. Submarines fit neatly into that framework. They were hunters of shipping, not instruments of bombardment. Japanese doctrine assumed they would remain offshore, submerged, invisible. Their danger lay beneath convoys and harbour approaches, not within sight of trees and rail lines. A submarine on the surface, close to land, was considered either damaged, desperate, or already defeated. Rail infrastructure reflected this confidence. Tracks often ran parallel to the coast, feeding ports and factories with little concern for naval interference. Anti-aircraft defences existed. Patrols existed. But protection from the sea was minimal. The idea that a weapon designed to stalk ships could strike inland targets simply did not register as a serious possibility. Optimized to fight the last war they understood, not the one still unfolding. Innovation elsewhere in the conflict had already punished similar rigidity, but here the lesson had not yet arrived. The result was a narrow field of vision. Submarines were watched for periscopes, not for gun barrels. Shorelines were defended against landings, not against precision fire from a surfaced boat. The possibility of a naval weapon being reproposed against infrastructure was dismissed without debate. Confidence does not announce itself as arrogance. It presents as order, as normalcy, as the absence of alarm. On that summer morning, nothing along the coast suggested danger. No siren sounded. No defensive crews repositioned. The war, as understood from shore, was behaving correctly. That was precisely the problem. Doctrine had done its job too well, filtering out what did not belong. And in that space, between expectation and reality, surprise did not just become possible. It became inevitable. American submarine doctrine in the Pacific was shaped by scarcity and patience. Boats were built to hunt commerce, not territory, to erase tonnage quietly, one ship at a time. Their purpose was economic strangulation, not spectacle. Success was measured in sinkings recorded far from shore, not in explosions visible from land. Targets were clearly defined. Merchant vessels, tankers, troop transports, objects that floated, moved, and could be tracked. Infrastructure did not belong on that list. Railways, depots, coastal installations were problems for bombers and artillery, not submarines. The ocean was the medium. The shoreline was the limit. Shore bombardment existed in theory but lived at the edge of acceptability. Surfacing exposed a submarine's greatest vulnerability, its hull. Aircraft, coastal guns, patrol craft, all could converge rapidly. A single hit could mean entrapment, flooding, or a slow descent with no escape. Doctrine was explicit: the boat was always more valuable than any opportunistic target. This caution was earned. Early war losses had taught American commanders how unforgiving mistakes could be. Submarines were finite, crews irreplaceable, and missions often extended thousands of miles from friendly ports. Commanders were trained to disengage, to preserve their boats for the next patrol rather than gamble them for uncertain gain. Innovation, when it occurred, lived in quiet corners. Skippers adjusted firing solutions, altered patrol patterns, bent engagement rules when conditions demanded it. But these were refinements, not revolutions. The underlying logic remained intact: submarines hunted ships. Everything else was distraction. Yet war has a way of pressing against its own boundaries. By mid-1945, the Pacific campaign had narrowed. Japanese shipping was already devastated. Opportunities grew rarer. Patrols lasted longer, targets fewer. Crews saw more coastline than convoys. The environment began to challenge the assumptions that had guided earlier success. This mission sat precisely at that fault line. No manual described what to do when a surfaced submarine found itself staring at land-based infrastructure within range. No doctrine explained how to evaluate a target that did not move on water. The rules did not forbid action, but they did not endorse it either. Stretching doctrine is never done loudly. It begins as a question, framed in operational terms. Is the risk acceptable? Is the effect meaningful? Does the opportunity justify deviation? These are not philosophical debates. They are calculations made under time pressure with incomplete information. For the crew, the tension was subtle but real. Training had taught them what not to do. Experience had taught them when to improvise. Between those lessons lay a narrow space where judgment replaced instruction. This mission drifted into that space without announcement. Doctrine does not collapse all at once. It bends first, quietly, under specific circumstances, justified afterward in careful language. What mattered in that moment was not whether the action fit precedent, but whether precedent could afford to remain unchallenged. Somewhere along that coastline, with a train moving steadily along tracks never meant to be threatened from the sea, American submarine doctrine reached its limit. And at that edge, it began to change. Surfacing a submarine near hostile shorelines violated the unspoken rule that kept crews alive. Below the surface, steel and silence offered protection. Above it, the boat became visible, vulnerable, finite. Coastal artillery, patrol aircraft, even small arms fire could converge within minutes. There was no armor to absorb mistakes, no speed to outrun consequence. The sea that usually concealed them now betrayed their outline. Escape routes narrowed the moment the hull broke the surface. Diving required time. Submerging under fire required luck. The boat could not turn sharply, could not accelerate suddenly, could not disappear on command. Every second spent exposed accumulated risk, and every calculation assumed conditions would remain stable just long enough to survive withdrawal. Reload times imposed their own tyranny. The deck gun was effective, but deliberate. Each round demanded coordination, precision, and patience. There would be no rapid correction if something went wrong. A jam, a misfire, a delayed order, any single failure could trap the crew in a position doctrine had warned them never to occupy. No manual covered this moment because no manual could. Written doctrine exists to preserve patterns that have already proven survivable. This situation existed outside those patterns. The submarine was not hunting ships. It was not evading destroyers. It was presenting itself deliberately, in daylight's approach, within reach of land-based response. The weight of command settled heavily on one decision. The captain understood the stakes without dramatics. He did not need reminders of what could happen. He had trained for restraint, for avoidance, for patience. Those instincts did not disappear, but they were overridden by a different calculation, opportunity weighed against probability. Commitment, once made, had to be complete. Half measures invited disaster. Hesitation extended exposure. The safest course, paradoxically, was decisive action followed by immediate withdrawal. If the submarine was going to risk surfacing, it would do so with purpose, not uncertainty. Calculated danger replaced habitual caution. Orders became shorter. Movements became precise. The crew shifted from theoretical risk to practical execution. There was no space left for debate, only for discipline. Each man understood that the margin for error had already been spent. Action, in such moments, does not arrive suddenly. It crystallizes. The alternatives fall away one by one until only one path remains viable, not because it is safe, but because all others are worse. When that realization settles, momentum takes over. The submarine had crossed into a category of war that did not yet exist on any chart. The choice had been made. Exposure was no longer a possibility, it was a fact. And once that line was crossed, the only remaining question was whether the risk would yield something decisive before the sea demanded payment. The deck gun was never meant to point inland. Its geometry assumed a horizon of water, a moving target silhouetted against waves. Now its barrel rose toward trees, ballast, and steel rails cutting across the shoreline. The transformation was physical as much as conceptual. A naval weapon, designed to fight ships, was being asked to behave like artillery. Fire control became an exercise in approximation. There were no tables for this. No pre-calculated solutions for elevation against land targets. Range had to be judged by eye. Wind mattered differently. The curvature of the shore distorted distance. What had once been precise routines turned into careful estimates, checked and rechecked under pressure. Elevation posed its own problem. Too low, and rounds would bury themselves harmlessly in sand. too high, and they would overshoot into terrain that offered no feedback. Each adjustment required restraint. Ammunition was finite. Time was more finite still. Accuracy could not be hurried, only earned through coordination. The train's movement compressed decision-making. It did not loiter. It did not wait. Steel wheels carried it steadily along the tracks, closing the distance between opportunity and disappearance. Every second narrowed the window. The crew understood that delay would not merely waste the moment, it would erase it. Coordination tightened instinctively. Orders shortened. Movement synchronized. Men who had drilled endlessly for ship engagements now adapted their habits without discussion. Load, aim, fire, observe, correct. The rhythm mattered more than speed. Precision replaced urgency. In that moment, the submarine ceased to be what it had been. It was no longer a hunter lurking beneath shipping lanes. It had become a static firing platform, exposed and committed, relying on discipline rather than concealment. Its greatest advantage, stealth, had been traded for immediacy. The boundary between sea and land dissolved quietly. No announcement marked the shift. No doctrine acknowledged it. Yet the implications were profound. A machine designed for one domain was asserting influence in another, not through redesign, but through adaptation. This was not innovation in the laboratory sense. No engineer had imagined it this way. It was innovation born of circumstance, shaped by necessity and limited by courage. The submarine was writing its own rules in real time, one shell at a time. As the gun fired inland, the war itself seemed to stretch. Categories blurred. Assumptions failed. What had been considered impossible moments earlier was now unfolding with mechanical clarity. And as the train continued its course along the shore, the crew understood they were no longer merely testing a tactic, they were crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. Impact. Armor was irrelevant. Velocity decided everything. Derailment followed not as a single event, but as a sequence. Wheels left tracks. Cars twisted. Mass displaced itself violently sideways, collapsing into angles that rail engineers never planned for. What had been linear became chaotic. What had been orderly became scattered. The first shell did not strike the train. It landed just beyond the rails, tearing into the ground with a violence that had no context inland. For a fraction of a second, nothing followed, only the echo, rolling back from trees and embankments. Then the meaning arrived. Steel had reached land from the sea. The train reacted as machines do when confronted by the unexpected. Brakes were applied. Momentum resisted. Cars lurched forward against couplings never designed for sudden reversal. Whether the engineer understood what was happening mattered less than the fact that escape was already narrowing. Rail lines offered direction, not freedom. The second shots came with correction. Range adjusted. Elevation refined. The shells no longer searched, they arrived. One struck near the engine, another amid the cars, metal folding inward under force meant for ships. The difference between land and sea vanished in the shock travelled faster than debris. Inland, people heard the concussions before they understood them. The sound did not belong to air raids or artillery barrages. It came from the wrong direction, with the wrong cadence. Confusion spread before fear could settle into form. Along the shoreline, routine collapsed instantly. Civilians scattered. Workers froze, then fled. No warning sirens had sounded. No aircraft had been sighted. The sea, long regarded as a boundary, had delivered force without transition. The shoreline erupted not with defense, but with disbelief. From the submarine, the scene unfolded without triumph. There was no cheering, no exultation. Only confirmation. Shots landed. Effects followed. Time compressed into firing cycles and observation. Each result reinforced the same truth: the engagement was real and it was working. The train, moments earlier an abstraction, had become a target with consequences. Infrastructure meant to move war material now absorbed it instead. The crew understood this was not merely damage, it was precedent. Something had occurred that could not be undone by explanation. The shoreline no longer belonged to one side of the war. It had been entered, briefly but decisively, by a platform that should not have been there. The distinction between domains, between naval and ground conflict, had been erased by action rather than theory. What made the moment unsettling was not its violence, but its clarity. No miracle had occurred. No rules of physics had been broken. A weapon had been aimed, fired, and adjusted. The only thing that had failed was expectation. In that realization, the impossible did not announce itself loudly. It simply became undeniable. And as smoke rose where no one had expected danger, the crew understood that the war had just crossed a line Japan had never prepared to defend. The response did not arrive instantly, but it was inevitable. On shore, confusion hardened into alarm. Orders were shouted without context. Units searched for the source of the attack, scanning the sky first, then the sea. The absence of aircraft only deepened the uncertainty. Something was happening, and no one had prepared for it. Return fire was now a matter of time, not probability. Coastal guns could be swung inland. Small arms could reach the shoreline. Patrol craft could appear with little warning. Aircraft, once airborne, would erase any advantage of surprise. The exposed submarine sat at the center of a narrowing window, its presence known even if its nature was not yet understood. Aboard the boat, the calculation shifted again. This phase of the mission allowed no creativity. The objective had been met. Anything more would be indulgence. The deck gun fired its final rounds with the same discipline that had governed the first: no haste, no excess. Each shot carried weight not because of its impact, but because it consumed time. Damage assessment was immediate and unsentimental. The train was disabled. Infrastructure was destroyed. Movement along the line had ceased. The effect was unmistakable. Whatever meaning the action would later acquire, tactically it had reached its limit. Staying longer would add nothing of value and invite catastrophe. The captain did not hesitate. Orders to dive were given calmly, as if concluding a routine drill. The crew responded with precision born of long practice. The gun crew secured their position. Hatches were sealed. The deck cleared. Every movement carried urgency without panic. As the submarine began to submerge, the shoreline receded, not in distance, but in relevance. What mattered now was depth, angle, speed. The ocean reclaimed the boat, drawing steel back into concealment. Above, the surface returned to silence, broken only by lingering smoke and unanswered questions. Escape was no longer abstract. It was mechanical. Dive rates were monitored. Sonar stations listened for the first sign of pursuit. The crew waited for the sound that would confirm retaliation had found them. None came immediately. Confusion, it seemed, had bought time. The sea closed over the hull completely. Pressure increased. Light vanished. The submarine resumed its natural state, hidden, cautious, alive. Yet the crew knew that something fundamental had changed. They had done more than survive an engagement. They had executed an action that defied classification. In war, turning points are often marked by explosions or losses. This one was marked by withdrawal. The decision to leave, to stop, defined the mission as clearly as the decision to fire. It preserved the crew and sealed the event into history without explanation. As the submarine slipped deeper, escape replaced action as the sole priority. Whatever response Japan would eventually mount would now be too late. The boundary had been crossed, the message delivered, the anomaly created. And in the quiet that followed, as gauges steadied and the sea reclaimed its dominance, the crew understood that the most dangerous part of the mission was not what they had done, but how little time it had taken to do it. The submarine slipped beneath the surface with practiced urgency. Ballast tanks flooded, the deck vanished, and steel surrendered itself to depth. Above, the shoreline that had seemed so close moments before dissolved into abstraction. The threat remained real, but it was now distant, filtered through water, time, and uncertainty. The most vulnerable phase of the mission had passed, replaced by a quieter danger. Inside the hull, sound became the primary sense. So now operators leaned into their headphones, waiting for confirmation of pursuit. Every creak of the boat, every shift of pressure, felt amplified. Then came the pings, isolated, tentative, poorly coordinated. They did not carry the rhythm of a hunt. They suggested confusion. Something had happened on shore, but its meaning had not yet settled into response. No immediate counterattack followed. No depth charges. No tightening net of escorts. The absence itself was information. Japanese forces were searching for a category that did not exist. Aircraft had not attacked. Surface ships had not been engaged. And yet damage had occurred. The submarine moved deeper, quietly, leaving behind an event that defied familiar logic. The crew absorbed what had occurred without ceremony. There were no cheers, no visible relief. Men returned to stations as if concluding a drill, though each understood that nothing about the last minutes would fit easily into a report. They had crossed a line that doctrine never described. Not out of recklessness, but because the situation had demanded interpretation rather than obedience. The attack was complete. The deck gun was silent. Ammunition was secured. Targets were gone. Whatever effect the action would have, material, psychological, historical, was already set. Staying would only invite disaster. Leaving preserved meaning. In war, restraint often defines success as clearly as force. As the submarine leveled off at depth, silence reclaimed the interior. Engines hummed at reduced speed. Sonar quieted. The ocean resumed its familiar pressure, sealing the crew inside a world where consequences travelled slowly. The moment stretched, then settled. What had been unthinkable minutes earlier now existed only as memory and record. The men aboard began to understand the weight of that silence. It was not emptiness. It was absorption, the sea taking in an anomaly and holding it without comment. The attack would not echo immediately. There would be no signal flare of recognition. History would need time to catch up. Above them, the shoreline returned to routine under shock and confusion. Below, the submarine continued its patrol, unchanged in function but altered in meaning. The boundary between sea and land had been crossed and withdrawn from in the same motion. What remained was not triumph, but awareness. The crew had learned something about reach, about imagination, about how quickly the structure of war could bend under pressure. They had acted outside expectation and survived. And as the submarine disappeared fully into the depths, carrying its story with it, the war resumed its rhythm, unaware that one of its assumptions had just been quietly broken, waiting to be understood. The patrol report was written without embellishment. Coordinates were listed. Times were logged. Rounds expended were counted. The description of the target was brief and factual. A surface submarine. A shoreline. A moving train. Fire delivered. Damage observed. Dive executed. The language followed naval habit, precise, unemotional, restrained. Nothing in the wording suggested that anything unusual had occurred. That restraint became the first problem. When the report reached command, it did not trigger urgency. It triggered doubt. There was no doctrinal category for what was being described. Submarines attacked ships. Aircraft attacked land. Shore bombardment, when it occurred at all, followed specific authorization and clear strategic intent. This did not resemble any of those things. It read like a transcription error. Questions followed quietly. Was the target misidentified? Could the train have been a coastal vessel seen at an odd angle? Had the crew confused secondary explosions for direct hits? Commanders did not accuse the officers involved of fabrication, but disbelief shaped every inquiry. War produced strange stories. This one seemed to stretch credibility past its limits. The difficulty was not evidence, but framework. Intelligence officers searched for a familiar template and found none. Rail lines were not part of maritime threat assessments. Shore defenses did not report naval engagements inland. Japanese communications offered no immediate clarification. For several days, the report existed in isolation, accurate in detail, unsupported in context. Then corroboration began to arrive indirectly. Intercepted messages mentioned a disrupted rail movement. Aerial reconnaissance noted damaged rolling stock near the coast. Local reports referenced explosions from the sea at an hour that matched the patrol log. None of these fragments explained the event on their own. Together, they closed the gap between improbability and fact. As confirmation accumulated, disbelief shifted into unease. The engagement could no longer be dismissed, but it also could not be easily absorbed. There was no recommendation to repeat the action. No directive to expand the tactic. Its strategic value was minimal, its risk substantial. The event resisted replication as much as it had resisted expectation. Analysts attempted classification and failed. It was not a bombardment in the conventional sense. It was not sabotage. It was not reconnaissance. It was a submarine patrol that had briefly become something else, then returned to itself. The war's filing systems, designed to impose order on chaos, had no place to store it. In official summaries, the incident was reduced to a footnote. In some records, it disappeared entirely, folded into broader operational statistics. The absence was not deliberate erasure. It was administrative gravity. What could not be categorized tended to sink quietly beneath attention. Yet the difficulty of naming the event was itself revealing. It exposed how strongly modern war depended on boundaries, between land and sea, between roles and platforms, between what was imagined and what was possible. This incident crossed those boundaries without ceremony and then withdrew, leaving confusion in its wake. History would later recognize the moment not because of its scale, but because of its defiance of expectation. At the time, it was simply a report that did not fit, waiting for an era willing to acknowledge that war sometimes advances not through grand strategy, but through unanticipated reach. And somewhere in the bureaucracy of a global conflict, a quiet anomaly remained unresolved, and action real enough to confirm, strange enough to resist explanation, and patient enough to wait for meaning. The review that followed stripped the event down to its essentials. Analysts compared patrol logs, intercepted communications, aerial photographs, and coastal reports. They searched for parallels and found none. The conclusion was careful and exact: the attack was singular. No other American unit had fired directly into the Japanese homeland from the sea. No doctrine anticipated it. No plan had authorized it in advance. That fact alone set the incident apart. Throughout the Pacific War, destruction arrived from the air or from distant waters. Submarines hunted shipping lanes. Bombers crossed oceans. Invasions, when they came, were expected to arrive with fleets and armies. This moment did not fit any of those patterns. It was not an invasion. It was not bombardment in a conventional sense. It was a brief crossing of categories that war planners relied on to maintain order. Strategically, the effect was negligible. A single train destroyed or disabled did not alter supply lines. No campaign shifted. No timetables were rewritten. Command assessments reflected this plainly. The action offered no measurable advantage that justified the risk taken by the submarine and its crew. In the language of staff analysis, it was an inefficiency. Psychologically, the calculus was different. The attack demonstrated something that numbers could not capture. Japanese defenses had been organized around assumptions about where danger came from and how it arrived. Submarines were a maritime threat. Rail lines were inland assets. Between the two lay a boundary that felt natural, even permanent. That boundary proved thinner than expected. The significance lay not in damage, but in reach. A weapon designed to operate unseen beneath the sea had surfaced long enough to strike a target no one had thought to protect from that direction. It revealed a vulnerability not of steel or concrete, but of imagination. The war had reached a place it was not supposed to reach. Yet the event remained isolated. There was no rush to replicate it. The risks were too high, the returns too uncertain. Submarines were needed elsewhere, performing roles they were built for. Innovation, in this case, was acknowledged but contained. The boundary had been crossed once, not erased. In official histories, the incident occupied little space. It did not fit cleanly into narratives of decisive battles or technological leaps. It appeared, when it appeared at all, as an anomaly, a footnote that resisted expansion. The war had larger stories to tell, and this one did not insist on attention. Over time, however, the meaning grew clearer. The attack illustrated how modern war blurred distinctions faster than doctrine could adjust. Sea and land were no longer separate arenas. Technology allowed force to appear where it was least expected, if only briefly. The psychological weight of that realization far exceeded the physical damage inflicted. For the crew involved, there was no ceremony attached to the act. They returned to patrol routines, carrying a memory that could not be easily shared. For the planners who later studied the war, the incident became a reminder that certainty was often provisional. What seemed impossible one morning could become historical fact by nightfall. The only ground attack launched by the United States against Japan did not announce itself as such. It arrived quietly, lasted minutes, and then vanished beneath the surface again. Its importance was not measured in territory gained or lost, but in the simple proof that boundaries, once crossed, never looked the same afterward. And as the war moved toward its conclusion, this small, isolated act lingered in the margins of history, waiting to be understood not for what it destroyed, but for what it revealed about how far a war could reach. In the aftermath, attention shifted away from the spectacle of the attack and toward what it quietly exposed. Military history often focuses on outcomes, territory gained, forces destroyed, objectives secured. This event offered little of that. Its value lay instead in what it revealed about the spaces between assumptions, the areas doctrine left unexamined because they seemed too unlikely to matter. Every system of warfare is built on blind spots. Not out of negligence, but necessity. Commanders cannot defend against everything at once. They choose what to fear, and in doing so, they choose what to ignore. Japanese coastal defenses were optimized against invasion fleets and carrier aircraft. American submarine doctrine was optimized for commerce raiding. Between those two frameworks existed a narrow strip of possibility that neither side had fully considered. The attack emerged from that strip. It was not planned years in advance or tested in exercises. It arose from proximity, circumstance, and a willingness to reconsider what a weapon could do when removed from its intended context. Innovation, in this case, was not the product of new technology, but of situational awareness. The crew did not invent a new capability. They recognized an unused one. Doctrine, by design, discourages such moments. It exists to reduce uncertainty, to prevent individual initiative from creating unacceptable risk. That restraint saves lives far more often than it stifles progress. But doctrine also narrows imagination. It defines what is reasonable, and in doing so, quietly defines what is impossible. The shoreline rail line fell into that category of visible, yet mentally excluded from consideration. The vulnerability exposed was not physical. Rails can be repaired. Trains can be replaced. The deeper vulnerability was conceptual. A defensive system had been built around an idea of where war could happen, and that idea had gone unchallenged long enough to feel permanent. The submarine's brief appearance shattered that sense of permanence without needing to sustain it. Small actions often produce the clearest historical inflection points. Not because they change the course of wars, but because they change the way wars are understood. This attack did not alter Japan's strategic position. It did not accelerate surrender. But it created a moment that could not be undone once it existed. From that point forward, it was no longer accurate to say such an attack could not happen. War repeatedly advances in this way. Not always through sweeping offensives or revolutionary weapons, but through anomalies that expose the fragility of assumptions. Each anomaly forces a recalibration. Some are absorbed quickly and forgotten. Others linger, reshaping doctrine slowly, almost invisibly, over decades. For historians, the challenge lies in recognizing the significance of events that resist categorization. This attack fit no established narrative. It was neither a battle nor a campaign. It lacked scale, repetition, and immediate consequence. Yet it revealed something essential, that modern war is less constrained by geography than by imagination, and imagination is often the first casualty of routine. The unpredictability of war is not a flaw in planning. It is a condition of it. No doctrine can account for every convergence of opportunity and risk. What matters is not whether blind spots exist, they always will, but how quickly they are acknowledged when exposed. In this case, acknowledgement came quietly, without celebration or replication. Meaning, then, is found not in the destruction caused, but in the insight gained. The attack stands as a reminder that boundaries in war are provisional, upheld only as long as no one tests them. When they are tested, even briefly, the map changes. Not always visibly, not always immediately, but permanently. And so the episode endures not as a model to be repeated, but as a lesson to be remembered, that the most revealing moments of war often arrive disguised as exceptions, waiting for someone to notice what they imply about everything else. By the summer of 1945, the distinctions that once organized warfare had already begun to erode. Sea power and land power, air war and ground war, these categories still structured doctrine, but reality no longer respected them. Total war had a way of compressing space, collapsing boundaries that planners once relied on to define safety. The submarine on the shoreline was not an aberration. It was a symptom of that collapse. For generations, the sea had been treated as a separate domain, governed by its own rules and expectations. Ships fought ships. Submarines hunted beneath shipping lanes. Land, by contrast, was assumed to be protected by distance, elevation, and terrain. The shoreline marked a conceptual border as much as a physical one. In this moment, that border dissolved quietly, without announcement, under the pressure of circumstance. Technology made that dissolution possible, but it did not dictate it. The deck gun was not designed for inland fire. The fire control systems were not calibrated for moving targets on rails. Nothing about the submarine had changed. What changed was how its capabilities were interpreted. Under pressure, technology becomes less about intended use and more about latent potential. War has always rewarded those willing to recognize the difference. Courage, in this context, did not take the form of aggression or spectacle. It appeared instead as adaptability, the willingness to act without precedent, the capacity to hold competing risks in mind and still choose decisively. The crew did not know whether the attack would succeed or whether it would provoke an overwhelming response. They knew only that hesitation carried its own danger, and that opportunity, once passed, would not return. The human cost of the moment was never foregrounded in official summaries. It rarely is. A train derailed. Lives were disrupted or ended beyond the frame of naval logs. The crew, too, bore a quieter cost, the weight of crossing a line no manual had prepared them for. Moral clarity in war is often assumed to come from rules. When rules fall silent, responsibility becomes heavier, not lighter. Power, in this episode, was unmistakable. A single submarine, briefly surfaced, was able to reach inland and strike an unsuspecting target. Yet that power was exercised within narrow limits. The attack was short. Objectives were constrained. Withdrawal was immediate. Restraint was not imposed from above, it emerged from judgment. In a war defined by escalation, that restraint stands out precisely because it was optional. Victory, measured conventionally, was marginal. No territory changed hands. No campaign shifted course. But if victory is understood as reach, the ability to project force beyond expected boundaries, then the moment carries a different weight. It demonstrated that distance no longer guaranteed separation, and that domains once thought distinct could overlap in ways both sides struggle to anticipate. As wars grow more technologically complex, boundaries tend to matter less, not more. Weapons become platforms rather than categories. Capabilities migrate. The environment adapts faster than doctrine. This submarine attack did not cause that evolution, but it illustrated it with unusual clarity. It showed that war, once unconstrained, does not respect the labels used to describe it. For those who experienced it, the moment likely felt less philosophical and more immediate. Orders given. Rounds fired. A dive executed. Silence restored. Only later did meaning begin to accumulate, shaped by distance and reflection. That is how moral closure often arrives in military history, not as resolution, but as perspective. In the end, the episode leaves behind a simple, unsettling truth. When boundaries stop mattering, responsibility does not disappear. It concentrates. Decisions made at the edge of doctrine echo longer than those made within it. And in a war that had already blurred the line between battlefield and home front, sea and land, combatant and civilian, this brief attack from the shore marked another step toward a reality in which war itself no longer knew where it was supposed to stop. Decades later, the incident survives less as a headline than as a footnote, briefly mentioned, rarely examined. It lacks the scale that usually anchors memory. No invasion followed, no territory changed hands, no campaign turned. Without those markers, history nearly allowed it to dissolve into obscurity. What remained was a patrol log, a handful of after-action reports, and a moment that resisted easy placement. The submarine itself returned to anonymity. It completed its patrol, joined the long procession of vessels that had done their work, and slipped back into routine. Nothing in its silhouette suggested what had happened that morning near the coast. Yet for those who knew the record, the boat carried a singular distinction. For a few minutes, it had crossed from sea war into land war, not by design, but by decision. The train it struck left even less behind. No monument marked its passage. No enduring image fixed it in public memory. It existed afterward only as absence, cars no longer running, schedules interrupted, a disruption felt locally and then absorbed. In war, destruction is often remembered through what replaces it. Here, nothing replaced it at all. Historians eventually returned to the episode not because of its damage, but because of its improbability. A submarine surfacing within sight of shore. A naval gun aimed inland. A target that doctrine never considered. The event forced reconsideration not of strength, but of imagination. It revealed how easily rigid categories fail under pressure, and how quickly opportunity emerges where planners assume impossibility. What shaped the moment was not technological novelty. The submarine carried no experimental weapon. The gun was standard. The ammunition unremarkable. What mattered was proximity, timing, and judgment. An unlikely platform, placed unexpectedly close, became decisive not because it was powerful, but because it was present. Wars are often judged by their largest movements, armies advancing, fleets engaging, cities falling. But they are also shaped by edges, places where assumptions thin out and individuals operate without precedent. This attack belonged to that edge. It was not meant to be representative. It was meant to be executed, survived, and left behind. For Japan's coastal defenses, the moment exposed a narrow but telling vulnerability. Preparations had focused outward, toward the sea, toward invasion fleets and bombardment groups. The shoreline was treated as a boundary, not a seam. The idea that a submarine might briefly turn itself into land artillery lay outside expectation. Surprise followed not from ignorance, but from certainty. For the crew, the experience carried a different weight. They had not set out to redefine warfare. They had responded to what they saw, within the constraints of seconds and distance. Only later did the significance become clear that they had acted in a space where rules blurred, where doctrine offered little guidance, and where restraint mattered as much as reach. Over time, the incident became a lens rather than a lesson. It illustrated how war is shaped not only by preparation, but by interpretation. How platforms become something else when placed under unfamiliar conditions. How boundaries persist until the moment they don't, and how quietly they disappear when crossed. In the long view of the Pacific War, the attack altered nothing measurable. Japan surrendered weeks later. The strategic balance remained unchanged. Yet history is not only a record of outcomes. It is also a record of possibilities revealed. This moment revealed that no domain was sealed and no assumption immune. They prepared for invasion from the sea. They never imagined it would come from the shore.